Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's edition of the online engagement series. My name is Andrew Patterson, and I'm the CEO of Family Daycare Australia. I'd like to kick us off this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all coming to the meeting tonight, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It's also my great pleasure to introduce our host for this evening, Family Daycare Australia's General Manager of Advocacy and Engagement, Michael Farrell. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Andrew. As always, very much appreciating you joining us to introduce the topic. And I think, as we usually do, before we introduce today's guest, do you mind just giving us your sort of high-level thoughts on tonight's topic, which is critical reflection, and your perspective on why you think it's important both broadly and in a family daycare or ECEC context?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael. And I'm by no means an expert on critical reflection, but I'll certainly share some thoughts with you. I guess, ironically, critical reflection is something that we all do probably on a daily basis, in just the ways in which we go about thinking about the things that we did, why we did them, and what we might do next time. So it's not a foreign concept to any of us by any stretch. But I guess in the early childhood education and care context, and in the context of this session tonight, we're really sort of delving into the processes around our professional and pedagogical practice, and the ways in which we go about using critical reflection in our ongoing improvement in our practice. Obviously, it is also an important element of the assessment and ratings process. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that whilst we undertake and engage in critical reflection probably on a daily basis, it's around that intentionality and how do we articulate our critical reflection processes, and how do we explain, probably in the heat of perhaps an assessment and ratings process, what our critical reflection process is, and how does it improve our practice. So I think I hope tonight will be a really helpful session for all of those online. We've certainly got some well-qualified guests joining us tonight to share their insights. And I guess the great thing about family daycare too is that everybody can bring their own thoughts and ideas around their processes, whether it's critical reflection or any other part of their professional practice. And tonight's forum is a really good opportunity for people both to ask questions, but also to share their own approaches and ideas. So it's an important subject matter, there's no doubt about it. And I think we're in good hands tonight to really dive in deep and explore critical reflection.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think really you articulated well one of the issues in which we're obviously going to get into tonight, and that is, the key point that I think that while education and care professionals and professionals more broadly would actively engage in critical reflection to varying degrees in their day-to-day tasks, I think that it is to step beyond doing that and to do it in a more sort of conscious fashion, and then be able to actually articulate it in a process that is, that has some formality around it, being able to document what that looks like without having a prescribed notion of what the sort of benchmark might be is challenging for educators. It's challenging at a service level, but I guess why we focus on this particular topic is that we do know how important, as you said, intentionality is to ongoing improvement, and critical reflection is a driver for that. Because if we can't reflect on what we've done, ask deeper questions to sort of better understand what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it, it would be difficult to sort of consciously make improvements on that. So I think that's a really key point. And obviously, we'll sort of get into that in more detail tonight. So thanks again for joining us. And of course, thanks to our wonderful guests that have given up their very precious time to take part in tonight's discussion. So tonight's episode, we are focusing on critical reflection. We'll sort of potentially start a bit more broadly and then narrow it down into a more family daycare specific lens. And we have two fantastic guests joining us on the panel who have been very generous in sharing their expertise with us on this topic. So tonight's first guest is the National Education Leader and General Manager of ASIQUA's Leadership, Quality and Regulatory Support Group, and has a long history of working in collaboration with family daycare, particularly in the delivery of professional development and the monitoring assessment of quality standards within family daycare services. So please welcome our very special guest, Rhonda Livingston. Thanks for joining, Rhonda.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. And I just want to take this opportunity to recognise the important role that family daycare plays in providing quality education and care to children. And just wanted to highlight the uniqueness of family daycare services as secure home-based settings and giving all children the opportunity to experience stable and reliable relationships. And I'm really excited to be joining you and Lyndall and Kerry. And I'm joining you from Gadigal land here in Sydney.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rhonda. Do you mind, just before we sort of get into the discussion and before we introduce Kerry, do you mind just giving us a little more insight into your background and with the EC sector just generally?
I'd love to. As you can tell by the colour of my hair, I've been around for a long time in our sector, and I have had a number of different roles, including working in the sector and working as an authorised officer before I joined ASIQUA. So I've had experience at assessing quality in services and also writing policies in a regulatory authority. And I'm excited to say I've been in the role of National Education Leader for more than a decade now. And I just thought it was important. I know that you know the role of ASIQUA and many of the people joining us today, but I think sometimes people get confused. We're an independent national authority and we work closely with states and territories and the Australian government to implement the National Quality Framework. And one of the key roles that our team plays is training and testing of authorised officers. So there's about 400 officers around Australia, but we also work collaboratively with the sector. And it was great to catch up with you, Michael and Andrew, yesterday in our office. We work collaboratively with the sector, but also with our colleagues in government departments, providing guidance and resource and services to support and strengthen the sector to improve outcomes for children. So as an independent national authority, we're not responsible for the assessment and rating or monitoring of compliance. That's the role of the regulatory authority in each state and territory. But as I said, we provide guidance to the sector and work collaboratively to make sure that the sector and authorised officers are getting that consistent message. And as I said, we have many diverse roles, such as training authorised officers. We also assess qualifications. We undertake research. You've probably seen some of our research papers and our snapshot on the website. And as I said, we support the sector to continually improve practice. And we also work with a broad range of organisations. So as I said, we're delighted to be working with Family Daycare Australia. I guess the knowledge and experience that we bring is that we have been, for more than a decade, developing nationally agreed guidelines, guidance and resources. And we work with our colleagues in the states and territories and the Australian government to implement the National Quality Framework. And as I said, we also provide the training to authorised officers. And I also just, Michael, wanted to take this opportunity to congratulate the national finalists for your recently announced 2024 Excellence in Family Daycare Awards. I think it's a great opportunity to celebrate the amazing contribution that family daycare educators, coordinators, and organisations like Family Daycare Australia make in the early childhood education and care context. So I'm very excited to be here.
I can tell. And thanks for the shout out around the awards. I'd have to mention that ASIQA has been a long time supporter, and yourself, Rhonda, and people within your team, including Perry Campbell, I'm sure everyone in the sector is quite familiar with as well, of supporting the awards process and recognising the fact that it is important in playing a role in recognising the amazing work that's done in the sector. And thanks also for giving some clarity around the role of ASIQA. I think it's it's a complicated role. We the work ASIQA has to do in a range of different areas in terms of working with all states and territories and the Australian government, often to try and find a sort of an appropriate middle ground. It's complicated work in a complicated area, but I should note that across the sort of lifespan of ASIQA, it is evident that ASIQA has been amazingly supportive of family daycare, and really makes such a strong effort to be inclusive of exploring the nuances of the sector that may differ somewhat from our centre-based counterparts. So fantastic to have you here, and we really, really appreciate your time. So Linda, I might hand it over to you if you want to introduce our second guest for tonight.
Yep. So our second guest has retired as a lecturer in Child, Family and Youth Studies at Griffith University, and is currently an adjunct research fellow, as well as an approved provider of We Belong family daycare services in Queensland. She is the director on the Family Daycare Queensland board, and she is a passionate advocate for high quality education and care, and has over 40 years experience in the education and care sector. So welcome, Kerry. Thank you for joining us tonight. And would you like to share a little bit about yourself with our audience?
Thank you. Yes, I will. And I'm quite excited to be here tonight, and thank you for inviting me. Critical reflection has really been a part of my teaching career for many, many years. My hair isn't, well, it's grey, but it's got colour in it. So I think I probably beat Rhonda. I've been around. I think I'm now called a bit of a dinosaur. But anyway, I worked at Griffith University with Associate Professor Jennifer Cartmell and Dr. Casley, and it was there that we developed the revised model of the circle of change, which is a critical reflection model, which I'm really passionate about. And I'm very appreciative that I've been given the opportunity to talk tonight about the way we implement that particular model in our family daycare service. So I have been around for a long time. I was a kindergarten teacher many, many years ago, and I was a director in a long daycare centre before I went into the TAFE sector, and was there for quite some time delivering the children's services qualifications. I did actually do a little stint in a film school for a while, and that was something different before I went to the university sector, and I enjoyed my I guess it was about 10 years there. So again, thank you, and looking forward to being able to perhaps answer some questions for people and give some insight into critical reflection. Oh, and I'm on Quandamooka land, on the beautiful shores of Moreton Bay, overlooking Stradbroke Island. So I'm very privileged to be there as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Again, I just have to say it's such a privilege to have yourselves here with such extensive and really grassroots based experience in the sector. I think that's really important in terms of having that sort of nuanced understanding of what's important to the sector and some of the differences that we might need to consider, I guess, especially in the family daycare context of important topics and like critical reflection and others that we sort of touch on in these forums. So thanks again for joining us. I probably just quickly before we jump into it, I think it's important to note that part of the rationale, I guess, for some of these topics is we try to take an evidence-based approach to, what is the best use of resources and our time and others' time in the sector that, again, take the time out of their busy days to sort of join in on these forums. And this one was important to us because if it's a subject, I think that some educators and services can find a bit daunting, and it is, in terms of the evidence, you look at the assessment and rating data, and it is critical reflection is within the quality area 1 and sits within standard 1.3. And if you look at the proportion of family daycare services that are meeting or exceeding or meeting or above the NQS, it's markedly lower than the national proportion. So in family daycare, it sits at 77%, as opposed to the national proportion of 94%. And then when you dive a little deeper and you look specifically at element 1.3.2, which is critical reflection, we can see that 20% of family daycare services are not meeting that element against the national proportion of 5%. So we try to focus on the areas in which we may need the most help or may provide the greatest value. But after tonight, we hope that those watching that are looking for support in these areas, or even just listening in just to try and get a different perspective from from yourselves, we're hoping that they come away with a better understanding to some degree, along with some specific tools and strategies they can use to assist themselves in their own practice, because I think that that's really important. So just before we get further into it, Lyndall, just as a former educational leader, do you want to share your thoughts on the importance of critical reflection, sort of off the back of what Andrew touched on earlier?
Yeah. So I guess for me, critical reflection obviously is broken down into, your part as the educator, and then obviously the journey that you have with that ongoing improvement within the service as well. And I guess in both cases, it just needs to be meaningful and ongoing, like Andrew said. I guess for family daycare educators, critical reflection, I used to say, is all about being curious and intentional. So from the moment that you start to reflect on a challenging situation, it's just like a successful activity, or just even how the day went, it builds that foundation for you to help to understand not only what works, but why it works. And I guess that why is the important question within critical reflection. It's that opportunity to grow and adapt and finding what really resonates with yourself as the educator, and then for the needs of the children as well. And I think, that ongoing learning that involves that intentionality or that intentional teaching is really the essence to help you guide your program and your practice, from your vision of your service to the practices that you use to then build those learning outcomes for the children that you're hoping to achieve. I guess as an educator too, you want to move beyond just pinpointing what worked for you and what was challenging. You want your reflections to have that critical moment in it where you are analysing your actions, what drives you to explore new ideas and approaches. So you want that really to sort of drive that program and practice and your implementation of it. And I guess that's where it can become daunting, and where you sort of start using words like analyze and critical reflection, that the educators give you that glazed look, like, oh no, what are you asking me to do? For a service provider and an educational leader, I think it's fostering that culture of critical reflection among staff. It's more than just trying to meet standards, I guess. It is creating a space where educators and staff feel empowered to bring in their own experiences and their own perspectives and insights into practices that you have within the service. I think it's important that we encourage educators to also reflect with us as staff, but also with other educators within the service to open that dialogue, so that you're getting more effective practices from others as well. So, having those mentoring sessions is important with the coordinators, but it's also the other way, looking at other diverse ways for educators to be reflecting as well. But I guess the most important thing, I used to say to my educators, is that critical reflection isn't a one-size-fits-all process. We all have different personalities. So what feels like a natural approach for us, or for one person, might be a chore for another. So I guess the key is to just finding that method of reflection that you feel comfortable and sustainable with. We will be building on strategies throughout the day, but it's making finding that way, that whether it's through a conversation or jot points or prompts or whatnot, but making it a habit, that it becomes embedded in what you're doing in your practice, rather than it burdening your practice. So when reflection becomes part of who you are, whether we're an educator or staff, becomes a powerful tool for refining and for improving yourself and your practices with the children. So I guess, as you mentioned, the NQF with family daycare can be something that we struggle with, but it's not because we lack the skills. I feel that it's just a situation that maybe is a bit more complex for what people are making it out to be, and maybe it's too hard. Well, from my experience, it's always been they don't know where to start with it. So I guess tonight we're going to hopefully unpack that concept, and whilst giving practical ideas, so that critical reflection feels more natural rather than intimidating.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you spoke to sort of educators that may not have a sort of set or established way of doing, need to find their own sort of method. And thinking about it, I guess, in terms of a process, there's different ways in which I guess you can think about it as a process, but it's really important, like you said, for ECEC professionals to find their own method, and then to make sure that it's meaningful and ongoing. It needs to be embedded into sort of practice and not made into some sort of burdensome, excessive framework that exceeds what's sort of possible to be doing in a meaningful and ongoing way. So, Rhonda, I think we may have in some ways sort of got ahead of ourselves a little bit. Do you mind sort of taking us through talking about what critical reflection actually is, and what's the difference between what we would say is just reflection and what is critical reflection?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Michael. And can I also say it's lovely to be here with Kerry again. She and I have worked together in different contexts over for 40 or so years that we've worked in the sector. But can I also, I'm really excited to hear more about that resource that Kerry mentioned, because we use it all the time, and we also promote its use because it's a really useful tool, I think, in terms of providing a framework. But I'll let Kerry talk some more about that, and I look forward to hearing some more of her insights. And as you said, Michael, the data around critical reflection, it's a challenging concept for all service types. Element 1.3.2 has always been one of the elements that have been most challenging. I think currently it's the second highest element not met across the nation. So I think it's really important that you're taking a leadership role in terms of this discussion today. And it can be difficult to differentiate between critical reflection and reflection. But I think there are some clear differences. And if we start with reflection, reflection is the repetition of events that have transpired. It's detailing what's happened during an experience or a situation. But critical reflection, as you identified, Lyndall, is taking it to that deeper level of regular ongoing thinking that goes beyond just simple evaluation and review. It goes deeper than reflection by including consideration of multiple perspectives or making the clear links between theory and practice, and making purposeful changes to practice to improve children's outcomes. I think that you made that point, Lyndall. And when critical reflection is embedded in your practice, not tacked on, but embedded, it can support and drive quality program planning and implementation that reflects the specific family daycare service context. And there are lots of ways educators can do this. As everyone, Michael, you pointed out, it's not a one size fits all, but educators can do this by questioning their decision-making processes, including how they felt and why, by challenging their curiosities and their potential biases, for example. They can do it by considering theoretical perspectives that link to or underpin pedagogy. And they can do it by questioning how practices value diversity and promote inclusion for all children. And ultimately, critical reflection is looking at the why. I think you pointed that out, Lyndall, behind all the decisions we make. And the approved learning frameworks reference the term critical reflection a total of 24 times. And that demonstrates the value and significance of this practice to achieving quality outcomes. And the frameworks explain that critical reflection involves educators closely examining what worked well and why, what will I do differently next time, and how can I further extend children's learning. So to answer that question, the difference between reflection and critical reflection is that critical reflection takes our reflections deeper by considering the views of others, including that of research and theory, and thinking deeply about how this transfers into a change or an evolvement of practice. And again, if we look at the National Quality Standard element 1.3.2, that's the one that's specifically linked to critical reflection of children's learning and development within the educational program. And so just thinking of an example might be that an educator has been reading the recent Australian Early Development Census, or the AEDC data, which indicates falling literacy skills in children in their local community. So they decide to consider and analyse the literacy-based experiences that they offer for children. And after observing a children using a stick to make marks in the garden bed, the educator consults with the child about their actions and thinking, and they ask them, what other resources could we use to make marks in nature? And they explore things like sand or different shaped sticks. And the educator gathers a variety of resources posed by the child, including drawing and painting mediums offered in the outdoor environment. And so in the next several weeks, the educator considers some questions such as, what does theory and contemporary research say about mark making and literacy development? What do families know about diverse mark making opportunities? And do all children have access to mark making opportunities in the outdoor environment? And then the educator and educational leader might explore their newfound knowledge of mark making, and they might draw on the work of Ursula Colby and her Rapunzel supermarket. And then they might think about extending this and using clay and clay tools to practice. and consider some of the children's creations as documentation, and see that as a way of making their learning visible for families as well.
Rhonda, I just took so many notes there. I think I won't sort of try and rehash what you said, but the thing that sort of stands out to me is, when you're talking about defining critical reflection, it's about sort of taking it to a deeper level, and it's about having, there's a multifaceted approach that you can take to considering the reasons or actions or events or whatever it might be that you're reflecting on. Usually, I guess, in a pedagogical context, it may be around, the actions of particular children in particular situations, and what that means by, taking theory into practice, assessing what the views of others might be, the sort of decision making that sort of led up to it, or assessing your own biases. And so, in its simplest form, I guess, I think, thinking about it, it's about reflecting, but taking it to a different level and doing that in a multifaceted way. And that multifaceted way could look like quite a variety of different things. And there's no, I guess, set way of doing that. And it would be informed by our own experiences and what we've been exposed to and things like that. And I guess that's why, mentors or staff have a role to play in potentially exposing educators or other individuals to their way of seeing things, or other things that we may not have been exposed to. Would that be a reasonable sort of assessment?
Yes, that's a very good summary. And I think also the role of mentor is important in building confidence, because educators know their children and their families and their communities better than anyone else. And so supporting them, supporting educators as part of that process to reflect, draw on the multiple perspectives, as you mentioned, Michael, I think is a really important role.
Yeah. So, Kerry, when thinking about critical reflection in the context of family daycare, did you want to extend on sort of what Rhonda said, or do you want to focus on why it's important from that particular context?
Sorry, I just unmute myself. I thought I'd just answer the question around why it's important in family daycare to start with, and then expand a little bit on that. So I think if we start around the relationships of family daycare, and I really, really think that that's the core of why it's important in family daycare, because of the relationships between our families, our children, the coordinators, the community. So it's around that personalised learning and care. And it's about, I think, being flexible and able to individualise approaches, such as being, and especially in our cultural responsiveness, I think that's important in family daycare. Critical reflection supports culturally sensitive practices, and that encourages all of us to examine our own biases. And I think Rhonda mentioned that as well, and Lyndall did as well. That critical reflection is important in family daycare because of that cultural sensitivity that all of us need to be aware of. So it's around being self-aware and providing inclusive, respectful care, especially because of our diverse communities, and that does include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. So I think critical reflection around those areas in family daycare is really, really important. I mentioned being relationship, and I think you need to be responsive about that. So family daycare is all about relationships. So we need to have strong and trusting relationships with all the stakeholders. So it's important through critical reflection that we can assess our own interactions, the way we communicate, and that fosters stronger open relationships, so we can support that. So And as well, being adaptable and professional growth is also important in family daycare, as it is in all areas of early childhood. But often more than often, mostly, family daycare educators work independently. And this can limit their access to peer support and also structured professional development. So it's important to engage in critical reflection with, for example, coordinators. And I actually truly believe it needs to start within the service, this process. It needs to start from from mentors, from coordinators first. And that's where I think the articulation can start, and then that can go through to educators and be able to help them articulate around critical reflection and put in place the sort of processes that work for everyone. And then I think what everyone mentioned too, critical reflection in family daycare also helps ensure that we meet our regulatory and obligations, especially around the NQS quality area 1. So I think with We Belong, we use an intentional conversation model, which I've mentioned is the COCR, and it really does assist coordinators to support the educators to implement changes in the service. As I said, it's been around, that model, for about 12, well, probably more, but for me, about 12 years. And it's important in all facets of our lives, I believe, as well as the work that we do. When it becomes embedded, and I think we'll probably talk about this a lot more, when it becomes habitual, you don't need to think about it. It's just there. It's just part of it. It sort of reminds me, as parents, if those of you there that have been parents of young children, we first start off with rocking the baby. We put them in the pram and we rock that. And you probably have seen yourself in the supermarket pushing the trolley, because that's in a physical, habitual way of doing something. So if we can involve critical reflection in our daily lives as well as our professional lives, it will become habitual. So I think the ability also to facilitate critical reflection in family daycare is a very important skill for coordinators, because they are mentoring and supporting our educators. It's also vitally important that we actually listen to each other, and there's different ways of listening, and that where critical reflection is, you really have to be truly present in the conversations that you have with each other. And I think one of the differences in my way of thinking, and people may not agree, but I think one of the big differences between reflection and critical reflection is that reflection you can do by yourself as you think about what you've been doing and things like that. But I really truly believe that deep critical reflection requires at least one other person to have that conversation and put that process in, to listen, to hear multiple perspectives, all of those. So, but the process is built from beginning of an understanding of yourself, and to understand that we've all got something to give, and therefore the right to participate in that conversation too. It's not it may begin with coordinators learning about a process and then passing that process on. Because I found with assessment and rating, to be able to articulate the process is as important as demonstrating the evidence, because the evidence of the process is the outcome. So if you can show the outcome of those critical reflections, I believe you're satisfying what you need for assessment and rating within those areas. So I'll leave it there. I could go on and on. I better stop and let someone else take up the other question.
Wow, thank you, Kerry. That was great. I guess to summarise, you started with saying that relationships is key, but essentially as well, in family daycare, we are working, educators are working in isolation, and I love the fact that you didn't, that it doesn't mean that we're not working without thought. You brought in the fact that we need to have those intentional conversation models, having that ability to engage in that critical reflection with our coordinators, and the coordinators really essentially being the person to assist and support that educator in their role. So, I think having all that combined really builds that confidence in that educator to, as you said, being able to talk the talk and articulate that through assessment and rating. So, and I love that even though we're working in isolation, having that other person there, like you said, to engage in that critical reflection is key, and so that we become flexible and we can individualize those approaches. So yeah, it just really resonated with everything that you just said in that. I guess continuing on, educators always, you did touch on it, and I guess we have touched on it in a number of the other questions. They always ask, when should we be doing it? When should educators and services be doing this? So would you be able to shed some light on how often educators and services should be critically reflecting?
How long's a piece of string is what I say. And I also say it depends. It really does. It depends on what's happening at the time. It depends on the issue that might come up. I really believe that there's no formula for saying you must do. What we've done I'm probably jumping ahead a bit here, but what we do at We Belong is we do formalise it a little bit in the monthly visits that our coordinators take on. Part of the visits, we have talked together from the month before, if you like, and looked at what's come up as an issue, or so it's a broad way of looking at critical reflection to begin with. So we come up with, we follow the process, and we ask the questions that we want to ask around the process of the circle of change. And that conversation is, the coordinators do that conversation every month with the educators on different topics, or it may be a continuation. So that's a formalised way that we do it. But we're building, and this is an ongoing journey, and everyone's at different stages as well, I think, in their journey, we're trying to make it habitual. And it just happens. So our staff meeting becomes a critical reflection. When we had our assessment and rating a little while ago, over 18 months now, and sat in the office with the assessors, we were actually having a critical reflection on things. And I pointed that out to them, actually, because that was So I said, we're actually having a critical reflection and I showed them the process that we use. So I don't think that there is really, how many, the same as how many observations. It depends. It needs to be purposeful, and I think Rhonda mentioned that, yourself mentioned that. It's not about, the day was great, but it may be a parent may have had a concern about a child that the educator's not feeling comfortable with. So that may be the time that, they might even pick up the phone and talk to the coordinator, and you can put a critical reflection in place then. So it really does depend, I think.
Yeah, I think I think when you speak, how long is a piece of string? Obviously, we started off by saying that it's not necessarily a standardized process, and it needs to be taken into account that different people do need to be able to do things in different way to achieve similar outcomes. And what we're trying to achieve with critical reflection, I guess it's around what outcomes are we actually trying to achieve in terms of our ongoing improvement, and better pedagogical practice with the goal of having the outcome of, the best possible learning and developmental outcomes for children in ECEC. But what you said around the way that in which you do it reflects sort of what you said earlier about how you think it needs to be both, embedded, habitual, purposeful or intentional, and sort of built into that daily practice around engaging with another on that. You said earlier around, that for you yourself, you believe that, true critical reflection, you require some sort of, interplay or exchange between persons to truly sort of achieve that. So, but as you say, it can work, in a range of different ways for different people. So, just got a final question for you on this topic, Rhonda. Can you tell us from your experience what are some of the common misconceptions about critical reflection?
Thanks, Michael. There are lots of misconceptions floating around out there, and one of them that we hear is that critical reflection is about finding fault or criticising an event or actions of those involved. And if we look at that example that I shared earlier, critical reflection provides opportunity for enriching the program. It provides opportunity for improving quality and enhancing outcomes for children and their families and the broader community. And in fact, critical reflection allows us to develop that deeper understanding of our practice, explore concerns or challenges, as Kerry just mentioned, but also to look for opportunities that will improve our practices and the program and raise the overall quality of education and care experiences for the children. And I think when educators engage in critical reflection, they develop confidence in their own professional judgment and the why behind what they do and being able to articulate that, as Kerry mentioned. And one of the other misconceptions that we hear is that an educator needs to use a template to show how they're critically reflecting. And there's no legislative requirement for educators' reflections to be documented in a particular way. And educators may choose to document their critical reflections, but it's really important, as Kerry said, that educators are able to articulate and discuss how critical reflection influences their practice and how it contributes to that cycle of planning and continuous improvement. And I think a really important aspect of critical reflection is about focusing on the process, not the product. And I think, Kerry, you made that point as well. And it's being able to articulate the how and the why about the decisions and changes that you make. And then this can be part of discussions with the educational leader, the coordinator, colleagues, families, and with authorised officers, the exact example that you gave, Kerry. And educators may choose to document key decisions that have stemmed from their critical reflection processes in a variety of ways within the program. It might be in the children's learning documentation. It might be in a reflective journal or a diary, or it could even be in the meeting minutes or the discussions with the coordinator, or perhaps through technology tools such as voice recording apps. And, one of the strengths and things I like most about the National Quality Framework is that each individual service and educator is empowered to determine which approach works best for them and what supports their practice. And so whatever practice or method you use, it's important to ensure that the approach is achievable and it's also manageable and sustainable, and that it adds value to the practice, and it's one that's contextually relevant for your unique children and families and educators and your family daycare community. I think there's another misconception that critical reflection, and particularly for element 1.3.2, should only happen around planned experiences. And we know that children's learning is constant and happening everywhere. And one of the guiding principles of the approved learning frameworks, equity, inclusion, and high expectations, focuses on equitable and genuine participation and inclusion for all children in all aspects of the program. And I think when educators critically reflect on all aspects of the program, they'll consider routines, transitions, planned and spontaneous play and leisure experiences, and they'll be empowered to identify ways to further improve opportunities for children's participation and to consider and work towards removing some of the barriers and approaching quality and improvement in a holistic way. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't really know where to start, but I think I want to start probably, you mentioned, and I completely agree, and I don't think I don't think anyone could disagree potentially, but I think you said one of the strengths of the NQF is that it's not entirely prescriptive. It allows for the freedom in which, educators or services can choose how certain things are implemented to meet certain standards or regulatory obligations, and you have an element of discretion and control over that. However, I would say that, and that was in reference to the misconception that educators, that there's this conception that you need to use a template on critical reflection. What would you say to, I am aware in conversations that I've had out there in the sector that sometimes services or educators do just want a template or do just want to be told this is the way it should be done. And this is, especially from an A&R perspective, they want to have that assurance around, well, this is what the expectation is. So I want to know what that benchmark is so I can meet that benchmark. Is there, what would you say around how to, and educators or services that are looking for clarity around what that benchmark is in critical reflection? Because it's probably harder than in some other areas to sort of quantify that or assess what that actually is.
Absolutely. That's a great question, Michael, because from my experience of working in the sector, I have worked with some amazing educators who turn themselves inside out because they really want to do the very best for children and families. And sometimes I think, templates and resources, if they're developed within, say, a family daycare scheme and they're really useful, they help you to, identify what needs to be documented or what needs to be followed up on. I think they can be a useful scaffold. What does worry me, though, is sometimes I think people get caught up in using templates that encourage a lot of busy work and don't actually capture the richness of the deep thinking and intentionality, intentional teaching that happens, all of the thought that educators put into their program and extending children's thinking and learning. So I think coordinators and educational leaders have an important role in supporting educators, maybe choosing something that is a good scaffold or working collaboratively to develop some kind of template or process that works in the scheme and helps everyone. As Kerry said, I think it's really important to have those conversations, and that it's really difficult to critically reflect without engaging in conversations with others and hearing those multiple perspectives and drawing on different ways of thinking. But I do get worried that sometimes we just need to step back and think about all the different ways that critical reflection is embedded in programs. And when you think about the way authorised officers collect information, it's through observing practice, it's through having those rich conversations and discussions. And we purposefully, because I was involved in writing the guide, we purposefully put documentation last. There is important to document children's learning, to document some of those aspects, policies, procedures, to document the actions coming out of critical reflection. but it shouldn't overtake the important work of educators with children and families. And I think that's a key message. Sometimes it's important just to step back, take a deep breath, look at what the national quality standards and the regulations are asking, and work out what works best for you and what's really meaningful and what's busy work, and maybe leave the busy work behind.
Yeah, that's a fantastic set of points there, because I think that it speaks to if you rely solely on a template and a set way of doing things in all circumstances in relation to, as you said, all aspects of the program, and you're relying on one particular template or one particular process as to how, to critically reflect on that, you are at risk of fundamentally losing one of the core aspects of what critical reflection is about, which is that it's a conscious and intentional process to go through that. So if you're relying on just this set, as you said, a busy work type of set way of doing things, then you fall at risk of losing some of the fundamental aspects of what it's about. And something else you said, Rhonda, and goes back to something Kerry said earlier, it was around the process and not the product. And so we're talking about, actually engaging actively and on an ongoing basis in the process of critical reflection and how important that is. So it's not necessarily, the end product of what comes out of that in terms of documentation, where you said that it sort of lasts. So it's about going through the process and not the product. But it goes back to something Kerry said earlier around, I think it was something, Kerry, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said something around that the outcome can be seen, can show that the process was engaged in. Was that something that you touched on earlier?
Yeah, so if you start, if you like, and this is perhaps providing it, excuse me, for assessment and rating. So you might start from the outcome and then go back to how it got there, rather than we did this, and then this happened. So it may be, thinking of an example, it may be that an educator has decided to revamp their backyard. So they've had to restrict children in going to that particular area. So they've moved to their front yard. So in doing that and implementing that, they've sat with the coordinator and they've actually gone through a critical reflection process, and they use the COCR. So it is a little bit, it's not templated, but it is a process that we do use. And so they've exchanged multiple perspectives about where the children will be, what they'll do, how it will come up, and why they're going to do that, and what's that based on. And then we always finish with, well, who will benefit from this? Who will benefit from this change or this practice? So if you're explaining to a assessor why the environment's different, say, well, this is how we got here, but this is what happened. So they can see the outcome and you're able to tell them that process, rather than, I guess, as Rhonda was saying, hand them a piece of paper that's got, we've done this, we've done that, we've done this. So it's articulating the process, but then showing the outcome. So you may talk the process, but show the outcome.
Yep. No, I understand. And I guess it's, the intentionality of, some of the things that we're talking about in terms of going through a process. It's not always about that forward-looking intentionality. It's about, like you said, we might have a particular outcome of an event or something that we sought to achieve, and then the intentionality is about critically engaging and going back in and reflecting on how we got to that point and what that means and what we could learn from doing that. So I guess it could go both ways. So conscious of time, we'll move on to our next topic now, which is sort of tools and strategies. So we're already sort of getting into that area anyway. because I think that obviously beyond having an understanding of what critical reflection actually is, the next most important consideration, I think, is how ECEC professionals engage effectively in the process of critical reflection. And so, Kerry, if I can come back to you first, what are some of the strategies you've already touched on, the COCR, but what are some of the strategies that family daycare services specifically, as opposed to just educators individually, can implement to ensure critical reflection becomes an integral part of their practice?
Okay, yeah. So just to begin though, I want to say that to be truly critically reflective, there's some, I guess, not parameters, but I think you have to be self-aware of your own biases, you have to be able to build relationships. So that's about listening very deeply, actively listening, and a term we use is generative listening. The one we need to go back one. Thank you. And the other one is building knowledge, and that does mean that we have to be aware of theoretical knowledge, of research, and of practice, and that may be lived experience as well. But I think that's where you have to start in building capacity for people to be able to critically reflect. So it's not just going out and doing it. It's building that capacity. So I'm just showing you here the process that we use, which is the tool, I suppose, that we use. And as I've mentioned before, that it's the basis of this critical reflection model is about relationships, and family daycare is built on relationships. So I'm just going to do this really quickly. This takes quite a few workshops to facilitate, but so I'm giving you the very brief overview. So it's about, first of all, coming together and then thinking about the protocols that you're going to use that that everyone decides on. So it might be that it's confidential. What is said within this conversation maybe won't go any further. The sorts of things that will listen to each other. So setting protocols and then building the relationships, which most coordinators will have with their educators. So this cycle has to start from that coming together and that building of relationships and being in a safe space. So if it's a balancing act, I think, for mentors and coordinators to be in the compliance space and then in the critical reflection space. So we try and put it together so that it's if there's a compliance issue, we look at multiple perspectives, and our educators, we want them to feel that whenever there's a visit or whenever we're together, it's a safe space that they have. Then it's about what we call the deconstruct stage, and that's about where we clarify our perspectives about, I guess, about a phenomenon, and listen to one another to understand various perspectives. For example, how would you describe what has happened? So that's the first stage in our process. And then we talk about confronting, and that's confronting the subject of the conversation around our own values and beliefs. So it's highlighting some of the inherent ideas that are accepted and rarely questioned about an issue. And it might be that a parent doesn't want the bottles of milk to go in the fridge. That sounds like a simple thing, but it can be an artifact to critically reflecting on working with parents or parents' expectations and that sort of thing. So it would be highlighting our beliefs around it, which takes us into and how we've felt about the situation. That's the hardest part of critical reflection within what we do. It is actually being able to confront some of the different aspects of what might have happened, and then to how we've felt about the situation. And then the next step is the theorise. So that involves discussing the source of our ideas. What value do we hold in thinking about the situation? What are the options that we might have? And that's the stage that we can share the sources of our ideas. And it might be our own lived experience, or it might be a theoretical knowledge that we bring to the conversation. And throughout this, we've considered perspectives. Everyone's listening to each other. We're listening to the educator's listening to whoever they're having this conversation with. And so then we can think, we may get to the think otherwise stage. Now, it might mean we have to have 4 conversations about a particular improvement or practice or issue before we get to being able to think otherwise about that perspective. So it's gathering all those perspectives that we might have, what we've learnt from each other, what we've learnt from theory, and then discussing about who might benefit from the outcome and what would be the impact of your thinking around it, reflection on the situation. What will you do next? And as I said before, for who benefits and from how. So if it's truly embedded into the pedagogy of everyone, and I mentioned before, there's really no formula of how often, and I've said it depends. So, however, there needs to be a purpose, and it needs to be the focused your particular service decides on at any one time. Our educators at the moment have been focusing on embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. So we've created reflective questions around that topic, and it's been a process of different conversations at different times. This has been happening over the past 3 or 4 months, really. We've had probably 4 to 5 reflective conversations, as I said, over the past few months within the coordination unit, and then the outcomes have been woven into conversations with our educators, and then further cycles of reflection have come from that. I think it's about facilitating the cycles of that reflection that underpin an educator's ability to create knowledge and then act together on that knowledge out of their individual and common experiences. So I think if we just go maybe slide 2. Is this me again? I think so. Build the relationships over time, and as you go about your everyday tasks, become the critical friend. It may be the coordinator with the educator, maybe an educator with another educator. That happens quite a lot. It can happen, when they've got a special relationship. It may be being a critical friend to a parent. You can run or have those professional conversations, critical reflection conversations with parents. You can actually have them with children, and we call those talking circles, but that's another thing. Think about the conversations you have when visiting services and how you can embed the model. I'm talking to mentors now, and work towards embedding critical reflection into your everyday practices. So thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. I think it's a really interesting model that applies a sort of really a practical process with quite specific and different considerations around the levels to it, because you said, you start with the coming together. So it's about whether it be physical or, the actual environment in which you are establishing or communicating, or establishing relationships or building on them, the manner in which you're communicating, and talking to things like protocols around how that's going to work to ensure that, there is a shared understanding of the process moving forward, and then steps into the actual process itself and some specific steps which I guess merge out, diverge into those sort of multifaceted approaches or considerations that we sort of spoke to a bit earlier. which I guess, I like the phrase around deconstructing the artifact, and then that leads into different methods or modes in which that can occur, coming back to a reconstruction process that leads to either a different way of thinking or a specific action. So I think that's, for me, is important, I guess, with this model or whichever model you choose to utilize. It's about working that through that process towards sort of where it takes you and beyond. So in terms of asking those deeper questions and getting a better understanding of what it is that occurred and why, but then with a particular view towards specific actions or outcomes coming out of that. So I think it's a really good model to consider, and would be sort of useful, I think, for services to utilize in the context of what that looks like in a sort of shared setting with both staff and educators in the family daycare context, where it's that satellite model where educators operate in their own home. You're not all together on one site. So there needs to be, I guess, flexibility around how that sort of matters. But it really comes back to those foundational considerations around relationships and how that sort of moves into specific processes from there. So I guess to move into more of an educator's perspective, Rhonda, what, in your opinion, sort of what practical steps or strategies can educators specifically take to critically reflect on their practice whilst embedding it into their daily routines, I suppose?
Thanks, Michael. And I never tire of hearing Kerry unpack that model. I think it's a really useful frame. And she and Jenny Cartmel recently shared that with authorised officers in a group that we were working with, and they really appreciated, understanding and unpacking that model as well. So I think there's a lot of value in finding resources like that, and that helps put some structure around the process. But I also think that educators who want to strengthen their critical reflection processes could start by just looking at their own reflective practice model. And they might want to ask themselves some questions, things like, what am I already reflecting on and how often? And how's it been working well in the documentation process and why? And who's it working well for? They might want to identify the challenges, if there are any, and why they're challenges, and who they are challenging for. They might want to consider aspects that they can modify to include documentation of critical reflection without needing to start from scratch, but also thinking about who will benefit and who will be advantaged or disadvantaged in that approach. But I also think it's important to identify who can support them in the journey and whose perspectives they can draw on regularly, and where they can find resources to support them. And as they think through these questions, they might gather some initial thoughts on changes or improvements that could be made to enhance their practices. And many of you will be familiar with the SMART goals. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And it could be a useful strategy for an educator to prioritise their improvements, because realistically, trying to achieve everything at once is not going to result in success. But SMART goals created by educators with the support of their coordinators can enable and empower educators to identify and articulate their own path forward. And I guess that strategy breaks down the improvement process into steps and helps the educator to identify goals and success measures that can be achieved in a realistic time frame. And I guess to create opportunities for critical reflection, an educator could establish routines that allow reflection to occur regularly. So that might include dedicated time, perhaps at the end of the day, to record their reflections in a journal or a diary, or it could be a standing agenda on their meetings with coordinators or their meetings with mentors. And they could also think about how children could be supported to critically reflect alongside them. And when you think about the early years learning framework principle around critical reflection and ongoing professional learning, it highlights that educators are co-learners with children and families and the community, and the value of continuity and richness of local knowledge shared by community members. So critically reflecting with children could also involve, as Kerry said, having those conversations with children behind the why and the how. And most importantly, how you then use that information to inform future programs and practices to improve outcomes. And we've talked a lot about the importance of getting those multiple perspectives and encouraging educators to work closely with their colleagues. And as Kerry said, having a critical friend to unpack their critical reflection, I think is really important. And we've talked about the uniqueness of family daycare, and also the creativity and innovation that educators and coordinators use to ensure that there are those opportunities for collaboration and critical reflection. And it could be things like regularly scheduled play dates or joint excursions, or just, as Kerry said, those opportunities for educators to observe and critique and learn from each other.
I'll hand to Lyndall just in a second, but I just want to re-emphasize, I guess, your the starting premise that sort of foundational premise that you started with there, Rhonda, I think should resonate as a key strategy, I guess, in being more conscious about how to move forward with embedding critical reflection in day-to-day practice, or making it more habitual. And you said start by asking, educators can start by asking questions. And then you started to list off quite a number of questions, but all the questions that you asked, they're not in one particular sort of area. You sort of, how are you reflecting, and how often, who will be advantaged or disadvantaged, who can support educators to do that, where can resources be found? So any manner of question you can pretty much apply to this process. And if educators specifically are looking to, what is just a core foundational principle to come back to in getting a better understanding of how to embed this process more effectively, to me that really resonated. I thought that was like, just start by asking questions. It doesn't really matter what the question is. It could be, there's an infinite number of questions you can possibly ask, and some might be useful in the end and some might not be, but actually asking yourselves those questions is really the foundational starting point for actively critically reflecting. So sorry to interrupt, Linda. I just thought that I just wanted to create that point because it really sort of stood out to me, Rhonda.
Well,
sorry, Linda. I was just going to say, we have developed an information sheet. It's called Developing a Culture of Learning Through Reflective Practice, and it's on our website. And it does include those questions, as you mentioned, Michael. And it also includes strategies that can support educators when reflecting on their practice and planning for children's learning. Sorry, Lyndall.
I was going to say, I was just about to highlight that first point that you made as well. You said at the start, what am I reflecting on and why? And I think after tonight, for educators and services, to really, think of where their starting point would be. I think that there is the essence of where you need to start. What am I already reflecting on and why? And then, I think with Kerry's, circle of change model, I think the essence of why that's so valuable is because it's visual. And I think once people, educators and services, work out where what they're already reflecting on and why, and then having some sort of similar model visually that they can put together for themselves. It allows it to be, a habit, and it allows it to be embedded, and it allows the educator to know how they're, doing critical reflection. So I think, essentially what you've said with what they're already reflecting on and why, the challenges that they've been faced with, and obviously all those other questions that Michael stated, I think that's the pure essence of the starting point of where, people can go from tonight. So, yeah, really, everything's resonating with me. It was great. Kerry, if we think about services and educators, are there ways that we can personalise the reflective reflection process to make it more effective? Like I'm thinking, and I guess more meaningful. So I'm thinking about how they can draw on their own learning styles for reflection, perhaps, through a visual manner or through verbal or creative, or other such examples. Oh, you're on mute.
I put it on so if I rattle, I'm not disturbing anyone. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. All of those things can happen. We have the Circle of Change revisited model up on the wall, just to remind us that it's there. We are giving it to our educators for them to put up near their planning cycle to think about it. Some educators have their own quip. Some services do the quip. We use it as, we have a creative, and it came from a lovely director that I work with at a long daycare centre, and she's developed a quip format, I suppose, if you like, that includes a cloud that's got the critical reflection in it, using that process. So, and I think record the conversations. The educator could just put their iPhones on, or their audio on, and have a conversation sort of with themselves, if you like, using some of those questions that Rhonda brought up. Also, page 18 of the learning framework, both in the ELF and My Time, Our Place, page 18 has questions there, and if you look at them, they actually cover that circle of like that deconstructs it. It thinks about the why. So that there's a process there as well, right in the learning framework. So I would encourage people to go back and look at page 18 and what else it says about critical reflection, to get them thinking about ways of looking at their own things. But yeah, draw a picture, draw a web of, put in the middle. I was, what's happening with whatever, and then draw off it there. What am I thinking about it? What are the questions I'm asking? But, what both Michael and Rhonda said, and yourself, it's all about the why before the how. And I think that if you can at least do that. So, yeah, conversation, drawing. When I say document, we put the little conversation into we have a software program that we use for visits and things like that. So the questions are there and I've said to the coordinators, it's not sitting down asking the educator the questions, it's for them to understand, the coordinator to read through those questions and then turn them into a conversation with the educator, and then we document that into our visit report, and that goes back to the educator as well, so they can see what they're doing. So I think that handy hints one, is there. So this is very broad. It's not particular, do this, do that, but you need to have sufficient time to do that. And I think Rhonda mentioned that for educators to think about it. I really believe all of us, coordinators and educators, I call it a journal of reflection, and whatever process that you might use or the way you go about it could be on the cover or just inside to just remind us and write in that journal what your thoughts are about things. We all need to develop and become good listeners. I think acknowledging that everyone can speak in that conversation, and we need to be open-minded and, to have a hopeful imagination. It's not about criticism or about what went wrong. It's about that hopefulness, gratitude, and belief in what we're doing. And that safe space is important. I've mentioned some of this. I think, and it's about whoever, whether it's an educator or a coordinator or mentor, we need to suspend our judgment, suspend our sense of judgment, and really be present in that conversation. Educators learn how to ask questions, ask the why, to start the conversation. Well, why are you asking me to do that? I've done this, what can we do about it? And then again, information flows in every direction. So be prepared to keep ideas on the focused topic. You've got to be careful when you're in the conversations that we don't wander off somewhere else. So again, that page 18 is really important, I think, as well as a starting point too. So thank you.
Wow, what a great little toolbox of tips for services and educators to have. Just conscious of time, Rhonda, I guess we have one final question in this topic. How can technology and other tools facilitate the critical reflection process for the services and educators, service providers and educators in family daycare?
Thanks, Linda. That's a really important question to unpack. And we've just recently done 2 We Hear You blogs on our website addressing technology use in services. And there's lots of great resources to help improve efficiencies and to capitalise on some of those opportunities. And Kerry mentioned using the audio function on the phone. I love using talk to text and then emailing it to myself, because you may have guessed I can talk much faster than I can type or write. And we know that technology can facilitate regular conversations between educators and with coordinators, etc. It's a great way of accessing information, but also exchanging information and undertaking professional development. There's online platforms like Teams and Zoom and WhatsApp. And there's lots of opportunities to streamline processes. And also, I think that drawing on research like from recognised authorities like Red Nose is easy to access through technology. When you're, for example, reflecting on children's individual sleep needs, it might be a great way to capture through an online survey to get the thoughts of your families, as well as that theoretical background information to inform decision makings. So there's voice recordings, there's voice to text apps, but I just want to make the point that with all innovations, there's important aspects to consider with technology use. And I know that parents have high expectations with the increased use of digital technology, sharing photos, etc. And it does raise questions about the impact of devices and what that means in terms of meaningful interactions. And especially when there's only one educator present, we need to also be thinking about children's rights and concerns about children and young people's safety. And as I said, we've got some blog posts. We've got one on digital technology in educational programs and practices, and another one on children's rights in their digital footprints. And I think they're useful to promote further reflection on practice. And as I said, they're on our website, but I particularly wanted to shout out for the new National Model Code for taking images and videos in early childhood education and care, and the guidelines that I think are really helpful in terms of supporting educators' practice around technology use. They're not designed particularly for family daycare, but there are some great tips in terms of technology and the use of technology that might prompt some discussion and reflective thinking in terms of all of the great resources that are out there in terms of technological advances that can support us, particularly in documenting reflective practice.
Yeah, I think, so I just wanted to jump in there because I think there's a couple of key points that, again, should be emphasized. One being the really significant number of resources that are available on the ASEQUAL website. The ASEQUAL website, has been updated and been sort of reformed over time to be more easily accessible. And the amount of care that's taken towards putting resources that really speak to what we're trying to achieve in terms of meeting the standards or exceeding the standards, but also some that are specific to family daycare. The ASEQUAL website is a great resource in general and provides for a great set of resources for all things NQF. So I would encourage, if you haven't sort of explored it in more depth, to take the time to do so. And a couple of other points, again, being conscious of time, what you said around, tech can be useful, things like talk to text, or there's a huge range of different tools out there, but actually being mindful and careful around the impact that can have, like you say, on meaningful interactions with children, or again, sort of doing things for the sake of doing, or trying to meet a set of expectations that's not actually there, or overusing the tool or template or whatever it might be to the detriment of actually consciously and meaningfully engaging in a process of critical reflection is an important consideration to be sort of mindful of. And the last point around the work that went into the National Model Code, I think, as you said, Rhonda, while there are some aspects of that are not particularly relevant in terms of those that are more have been developed around center-based considerations specifically, there are certainly a number of topics and areas that are covered in the National Model Code that are useful for considering in a family daycare context. And actually, FDCA is doing some work which will be published in the not-too-distant future around specifically device use in family daycare and what that means in terms of taking into account some of the important areas of the National Model Code. So I probably wanted to move. We did have a question in this area, but I think we've already largely covered it off. It was around having standardized guidance. There was a question around why is there no clear and standardized guidance provided to the services. We've already sort of covered that area. So I think just to be sort of noting that we're already sort of almost over time already, I'll move to the next topic. And this is looking at applying and demonstrating critical reflection from an educator's perspective. So, Kerry, when it comes to a service, how can a service support educators in developing a toolbox or set of skills for critical reflection? I know we've already touched on it, but I think it's important to sort of end in this very sort of practical sort of place.
I think the most important thing is to be able to listen to educators, to open up our own ways of thinking, especially when we're working with educators from a range of cultures. In our service, we have a lot of Korean educators, so they have their own ways of thinking and doing. And so we have to, there's nothing wrong with adapting the process that you have of your critical reflection to be able to make it meaningful for others. And it's something that we talked about at assessment and rating, and I think it's important for everyone to realise that each educator is at a different level of their own journey, especially with critical reflection. This takes time to develop. It's not easy. It can become habitual, but it's another skill. and it's about building knowledge. So I don't think you can just rush out tomorrow and say, right, this is our process, we're going to do this, and expect everyone to do it, even coordinators. It's taken time for our service to get to a point where everyone is feeling comfortable in having critical reflection processes. So I think those handy hints that I had up before, I probably skipped ahead a bit myself, but they'll be available for people to have a look at?
With I think we're at the end of we've got a set of links, and we'll provide those in the chat as well.
Yeah, so I'm happy for people to be able to have the 4 slides. They're only brief, but so I think supporting educators, why not give them a journal? We're looking at actually providing, as I mentioned before, a journal that's going to have the process in it for them, and some general questions which we'll take from the early years learning framework and put in that journal, have it printed so that they've got them there. But it's about, I think, that building of relationships and providing a safe space for them to be able to critically reflect about their practices, because they're coming from a different point of view from each other, from us, and so I think it's that being mindful and suspending that sense of judgment.
Yeah, I think some really good points there about listening, about taking into account that educators can come from a range of different cultures, and that particular processes that we might have, or particular ways of doing things, can be adapted. And it's important, I guess, for services to critically reflect on the way in which they do these things on an ongoing basis when engaging with educators from different backgrounds or different skill sets in terms of their experience in the ECE space. So that's a really, really important perspective, because to do that well for educators, services need to be able to do it well themselves in how they apply certain processes or confront their own biases around how they do certain things, or how long they've done certain things without taking into account that there may be other ways of doing them. So
can I just add too that if you are in the community and have a relationship with elders, even, that you talk to them about reflecting, and the process really is built around that ancient way of yarning, and being kind and respectful of people. So that's another point for people to think about.
Yeah, that's again, taking into account particular cultural considerations, being on country, listening to elders. That's so important from all, in our interactions with SNAKE in particular, which is the Secretary of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare. So many of those conversations around, how should we do certain things if we're engaging with elders or children from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island backgrounds. It's all, a lot of it comes back to, start from a place of listening. That's just so important. So, Rhonda, I think, again, sort of trying to head toward in a timely fashion, because again, we're sort of getting over time here, with a view to sort of thinking practically, evidence and documentation is an area that can lead to confusion or unnecessary work. We sort of touched on that a bit earlier. You mentioned before that sort of busy work, and we need to be cautious about heading those directions for both educators and services. So what evidence or documentation can educators and services provide to demonstrate that they're engaging in critical reflection in an A&R rating process? I guess being mindful of the fact that I would preempt your response by saying that you're probably not going to be too prescriptive in this response, but I think it's a good place to sort of consider when we're thinking about making it into a meaningful and practical, from a meaningful and practical perspective for services and educators.
You must be psychic, Michael, because you're right. There is no template or recipe, but I would really encourage people to go to the Guide to the National Quality Framework. And that's one of the things I love about the NQF is that it's transparent. There's no hidden agendas. When we train authorised officers, we use the Guide to the National Quality Framework. And I mentioned earlier about the observe, discuss and cite evidence. There are some examples in that guide about things that authorised officers may, and we purposefully put may want to observe or discuss or cite. And having been involved in the development of that guide all those years ago, I know it's been refreshed and refined a few times, but when we started to put those dot points down, we were really nervous and thought, there's no way that we can know the rich practice that's happening out there or anticipate the practice that's evolving. So I'd really encourage educators and coordinators, educational leaders to be confident and think about what that observe, discuss and cite. What do you want the authorised officer to observe? What do you want to discuss with them? What evidence do you want to share that gives them confidence that you are critically reflecting and making some changes? And I think the quality improvement plan is a good way to do that, as is the SIP. If you've got a strategic inclusion plan as well, that's a great way of documenting the reflection that happens, what action you're going to take. A RAP might be a similar tool that you will use to identify how you've reflected on embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and what action you're going to take. But there is no recipe. Just doing that will not necessarily give confidence. Officers might want to cite documentation, such as reading a policy. You might want to use some of your staff meeting minutes that, as Kerry said, you might have unpacked in a meeting with a coordinator, something really important in terms of practice, and had some deep thinking and discussion about that. It might have been shared with families in a newsletter. So there are lots of ways of documenting critical reflection. It doesn't have to be added on. It should really be embedded in practice. And as I said, there are lots of examples in the guide. The authorised officers, for example, may observe service practices and interactions. They might observe educators making brief notes so that they can recall aspects of practice that are challenging them. They might observe some conversations about critical reflection. So there's lots of examples in the guide. So I won't go into that, but I will encourage people to use that as a starting point and be confident and think about what you want to share in terms of the conversation, documentation that you might want them to see, and also what you'd like them to observe. And using the self-assessment tools are a great way of practicing that skill and identifying what you really want to share. I've tried to say that quickly. Sorry, Michael.
No, I'm conscious of time. I don't want to hold everyone up, yourselves as well as our audience. And we might have to skip a couple of our pre-submitted questions. But just while we're in that space, Rhonda, do you, in that sort of, you said go to the guide. It's the guide to the NQF. It's really a foundational document. There's lots of ways of documenting, but there's so many sort of hints and tips around things to consider in utilizing the guide, utilizing that concept of what what authorised officers might want to observe, discuss, and cite. You can see throughout the document, because it really is that sort of guide to going through that assessment and rating process. And there's, you could reference your SIP or your reconciliation action plan, or a number of different sort of things. But just on the topic of utilising the guide for the NQF. How can critical reflection be linked to the exceeding themes, and what steps can services take to achieve that?
That's a great question. And we've got lots of really rich case studies on our website. We've got one for each of the 15 standards, and we've got a set that focuses on examples from family daycare. And of course, firstly, you've got to meet the element in the overall standard. The standard's got to be meeting NQS. And then you just need to think about the 3 exceeding themes. That is, practices embedded in service operations, practices informed by critical reflection, and practice is shaped by meaningful engagement. And you must be able to demonstrate that within each standard for the quality area to get that exceeding rating. And we often get asked questions about what's the difference between element 1.3.2 and the exceeding theme 2, which is practice is informed by critical reflection. And just the focus of critical reflection in the element, it's specifically linked to the educational program that's being delivered for each child. And the educators and services have critically reflected on their program and how it supports children's learning and development, as we've spoken about previously. But when we think about the exceeding theme 2, practice is informed by critical reflection, it describes the deeper level of reflection that examines practice across all areas of the NQS and the service operations. And it's seeking to find better and more equitable ways to improve outcomes for all children and families. So it does, there are some really great case studies that relate to family daycare. And we've also done some blogs. One of our newest blogs is on unpacking critical reflection in standard 1.3. And it discusses that and offers some detailed examples and case studies. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at that. I know that we were talking once, not so long ago, with an area manager who their service had just been through assessment and rating, and they had considered that their service was at that exceeding level. But once they'd worked through some of those case studies, they understood and recognised what authorised officers were looking for when they're assessing and rating. And again, can I just put in another plug for the guide? Because in the guide, there are the questions that authorised officers use to determine if practice is exceeding. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at that information and use it and unpack it as a team.
Yeah, thanks for shouting out the resources there. I mean, that Exceeding the NQS series, again, it speaks to the fact that there are so many great resources on the Sequel's website, and having been involved with some of your team in the development of those series that it was specific to family daycare, and the effort that was made, I guess, by your team in terms of linking through to obtain those particular case studies and really dive deep on the family daycare context in relation to those specific themes, with a view to provide a meaningful resource to support family daycare services that have a different context in the delivery of some of the, meeting some of the standards or being able to exceed some of the elements or standards. I think is, it just goes to show that it's that the level of effort that goes there and the amount of support in terms of resources that's available on the ASEQA website. So I think that was a really good shout out.
What excites me about those case studies is they're genuine. They're based on genuine examples too. So great that's happening.
Again, yeah, and that's right. I mean, the effort that was made to engage specifically with services to obtain real-life case studies from services, that sort of level of effort, it can't really be overstated, and that's why they are so meaningful in what they can provide in terms of support. So, good shout out, I think. Again, running sort of quite past time here, but just a final question for you in this space, Kerry. Can you speak to, how can services create a supportive environment that encourages a culture of critical reflection? And we talked about, the fact that it needs to be sustained over time. It needs to be an ongoing process. And from your perspective, what role does leadership specifically play in this?
I think they have to be committed to it. It has to be part of their own pedagogy as leaders, to be prepared to take part in the process whenever possible. I think that to create that culture, then I suppose I can only give examples really of every week we have a staff meeting. And so, as I said before, we discuss the sort of questions that we might be putting into our visits each week. And I always remember, it's a few years ago, one of my coordinators who has moved on now, but she said to me that, well, I wrote it down here. Just so I guess it's about having, when you say in the culture of the service, it has to be embedded in what you do. So I make sure that I include everyone in whatever conversations, and it turns into a critical reflection, because it's so embedded in my thinking that, I those steps that deconstruct, confront, theorize, think otherwise. You don't have to sit down and go, okay, we're going to deconstruct. We're going to do this. To begin with, yes, we used to follow that, but now it's just part of the way we are. And that was one of the things that I found difficult in assessment and rating, to be able to explain that to the assessors at the time, that it's just what we do. But we've got better at having evidence now, in being able to say, well, it's nothing that we step outside our normal ways of doing. But I think she was the educational leader at the time, and it does become a habit. And she once said to me after a meeting, "You've just done COCR with us, haven't you?" Because it's just what we did. So people aren't aware of it, but you're just doing it. Like, in a way, this evening's been a critical reflection of critical reflection. So if people want to use their little initiative out there, they could go and write a summary of what we've learned, what we've talked about, and they have some evidence of professional development of using critical reflection. So you can weave it in wherever you are. Yeah. I hope that answered that question.
Yes, no, it did indeed. Well, again, just sort of conscious that we went quite a bit over time. I would just, like to just say a huge thank you to both of you for sharing your expertise and, the history and thoughts that you have in terms of diving into this topic from a family daycare perspective. Apologies also, we didn't get to some of the pre-submitted questions, but it was just a topic that obviously we had a lot to say about. Just before we wrap it up, both Kerry and Rhonda, do you have any just quick final thoughts for us before we wrap it up for the night?
Just do it, everyone. That's my final thought. It's out there. There are, as Rhonda said, there's lots of resources. There's a few about the COCR that I know, Michael, you're going to share in some way.
Yep.
with the audience, that they can download some guides on that particular process. When I say just do it, get together, talk about what process you want to use, and do it.
Yep, and be confident. And for those of you who might be in the educational leader role, just to shout out, there's an educational leader resource addendum focused on family daycare, and it addresses the issue of critical reflection as well. But I think there are some great resources out there, but also will be confident in the great work that you're doing, and also be open to the opportunities that critical reflection allows in terms of building on the great work and continually quality improving your programs and practices and philosophies and policies. And thanks again for inviting me to join you all. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. Don't forget, if you want to go back and view tonight's episode again, it'll be available to all FDCA members via the member zone. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next online engagement series episode. Thank you again, Rhonda and Kerry and Lyndall. Have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi.